Hello, this is Bad Vibes. Today's video is on killers and possible future killers. Some of these stories are rather old and kind of popular on Reddit, so they've been told over the years, but I wanted to put a long video together on this topic. There'll be timestamps so you can skip any story that you've heard already if you don't want to hear it again, and sit back, relax, and enjoy. I moved to the US for a postdoctoral fellowship in Baltimore, Maryland. This is a city where black women regularly disappear, and recently a serial killer, Joe Metheny, was outed in Baltimore as feeding his victims at a local butcher shop that he ran. This story happened to me in 2019 and is not related to Joe, who died in 2017. Compared to my home country, the weather in the US East Coast is hot and muggy. So I used to dip out of the lab and take walks at a nearby park during office hours. I did this maybe 50 times, exploring the vast park with its river, its bottom piece, and upper trails. It was not too secluded, and you could definitely spot people jogging, which put me at ease. Nevertheless, in Baltimore, the crime is infamous. I've had several hairy encounters in my time here. Ironically, more in Washington, D.C., which is about an hour away. Now, one day I'm sitting at the bottom of our local park, taking in the sun. It's maybe 4 p.m., and I need to get back to work soon. Suddenly, I see a stranger in the distance. This is the first time I've seen someone down here, as the bottom part is very secluded. But as I described above, you can spot joggers along the trails surrounding the bottom part, so it's not too isolated. I immediately sense that something is very wrong. He is staring at me and not moving, and then he starts talking to me, showing me some sort of map that he's holding with his right arm extended out towards me, asking me to come over and show him where we are on the map. I am frozen and extremely scared. Something about this situation is very off, and I've been all over the world, and this is a first. Something about him was just wrong. I then noticed something truly disturbing. In his other hand, which was elevated, he's holding a very large rock. He kept telling me to come over and show him something on the map. I freak out because the only way to get away is to run right around him or run backwards deeper into the bottom of the park. I shouted no, and miraculously, he lowered his arm for a moment, allowing me to run past him. I ran and ran until I was back on campus. I really wanted to call the cops and report this, as I know I became very close to becoming another stat in the city where people regularly disappear. Because I was technically supposed to be at work, I never reported this to anyone except my closest friend. He believes I was indeed faced with evil. In 2006, I lived in South Bend, Indiana. I worked overnights at a Walmart, and I had to walk to work. It was 5 miles, and it wasn't the greatest way to travel. The trip took me through the north end of downtown, past Notre Dame's golf course, campus, and eventually to Roseland, then finally to the Walmart. With 2 exceptions, I never passed by any pedestrians. One guy was on a bike, one of the first nights I made the trip. He was fine. It was that other guy who was strange. There's a section of the street from the top of South Bend to the bottom of the golf course that there were no street lights and barely a sidewalk to walk on. The last night I was employed at Walmart, in the pitch black, I passed this guy. While the car passed by, I noticed there wasn't anything physically abnormal, but as soon as I saw him, I got the creeps. He was around 5'10", 200 pounds, dark hair, and was staring directly at me. As he was walking towards me, I started sweating and was becoming terrified really quickly. As we passed each other, everything in my body screamed to run as fast as I could, so I did. I was a big dude, but I ran like the wind, too out of breath to scream. When I couldn't run anymore, I turned around, convinced that I was gonna die, and saw no one. Great, I just freaked out for no reason. I continued my way, finished my shift, and went home. Nothing else happened while I was in Indiana. That week, I moved back to Tennessee and continued my life thinking nothing about that night. 1 week later, I received a phone call from one of my dad's police officer friends from South Bend who wanted to make sure I was okay. I confirmed that I was 300 miles away, safe and sound. He explained to me that they were working on catching a serial killer who was targeting homeless people and shoving their bodies into manholes. He described a guy who was 5'10", around 200 pounds, dark eyes, dark hair. I was terrified all over again. He described what sounded like the guy that I saw. He said the path of murder was crossing the path to my work, a path I had walked for 6 months. I have no idea what could have happened if I stayed at that job for another week. For context, I didn't grow up in a good area. I won't give the location for privacy, but I live in a fairly large city. At the time, I was around 10 or 11. This was overall not a good area, lots of gang activity, drug use, those kinds of things. One of those neighborhoods with all those jacked up sidewalks and shopping carts strewn everywhere. There was a park a couple blocks away from my house, and I decided to go on a run there and spend some time there on my own. I don't know why I was allowed to leave on my own, knowing the area. It was still light out when I jogged down there, but it started getting dark by the time I actually reached the park. It was around dusk. The layout of the park, it faced out long ways, so the shorter side was where the gate was. It's hard to explain, so I attached a picture to show you all what it looked like. There was a set of swings at the very front, and I sat down to hang out there for a bit. At the time, I didn't have a phone with service. I just had music downloaded to listen to. I was sitting with my earbuds in and got a really awful feeling. It felt like a tingling on my back, and I knew something was up. I took one earbud out and kept swinging, but I couldn't shake that feeling. Finally, I turned around to check behind me. There's an alleyway leading into the park that curved so you could only see part of the way down. It was all white gravel. Down the alley was a dumpster. There was a figure on the ground with a ton of red stuff around him, which I now know was blood, and another guy standing walking towards me, fast. The alley was across the playground, about 40 feet maybe. As soon as I saw the man approaching me, I dipped the fuck out of there. He had something in his hand, but I couldn't quite see it. He was holding it like a knife or a pair of scissors. I sprinted a couple blocks back to my house, got into the back, and made sure no one saw me. I didn't tell my dad until years later, and he fully believed me. The area was bad news, and I'm amazed something bad didn't happen to me with how much I was left out alone. So when I was around 6 years old, 23 now, just before starting school, I had to stay at my grandparents' place for around 6 months due to my parents constantly traveling for work. This happened in Europe, a little country called Lithuania. It's a really cool and modern country. They lived in a block of flats, 5-story building in a peaceful community neighborhood. My grandmother was working as a nanny at the time, and she had one more girl which was from Washington, US, staying with us. Me and the girl were playing outside when we noticed a man in a brown leather jacket with brown pants lingering around the block at the entrance of our block of flats. Being kids, we didn't pay too much attention to him or find his behavior suspicious. I remember passing him by the time we had to go home and him holding the door open for us. He had dark hair and almost neon blue eyes. My grandmother's flat was the last one, 5th floor. The three of us were having dinner while my grandfather, who at the time was working night shifts at a local billiards club, was leaving for work. So we have dinner, say goodbye to my grandpa, and we're off to bed. Mind you, back then nobody locked the front door of their apartments or houses because everybody knew everyone in the neighborhood and trusted them. My grandmother was telling us a bedtime story and it was already dark outside, late August. We heard 3 muffled sounds as if furniture was falling. My grandmother rushed to lock the door for some reason. She tells us it's probably someone redecorating or moving their furniture, and we eventually fall asleep. Fast forward to the next morning. My grandfather's coming back from work. It's around 6 a.m. He finds the front door of an apartment that belonged to a family on the 3rd floor wide open. He walks in and finds a dead grandmother and a boy, which was around 5 years old, and also one of my friends dead, with gunshot wounds. Me and the girl from the US are immediately woken up. There's police everywhere. We were asked if we saw anything suspicious or people not from our neighborhood. Of course, we remembered the man. Later on, he was found guilty of this particular murder, and it was all over the local newspapers. Since then, everyone I know, including myself, locks the doors. Creepy murderer, let's not meet again. This didn't happen to me. It happened to my dad when he was 17 in 1982. He ran away from home because he was in some kind of trouble. He never told me exactly what he had done, but I knew he had a pretty crazy youth. To escape getting into trouble, he went to London and stayed in a bar near a train station for a few hours, trying to figure out what to do next. Very quickly, he was approached by a man who sat next to him and kept buying him drinks. The man was kind, charming, and really seemed to empathize with my dad. He offered to let my dad stay with him for a few days, free of charge. My dad said he really considered it, actually thinking he might go there and steal from the man, but changed his mind in the last minute because the man had been kind to him and he went back home. About a year later, he had met my mother and they were watching the news when the same man popped on the TV, having been arrested. He learned that the man was Dennis Nielsen and was the same man that he had been talking to for hours in the pub in London. Apparently, when Nielsen appeared on the TV, my dad turned ghostly white and started immediately shaking. Although it's not my experience, I was always extremely careful and wary of people I don't know. Dennis Nielsen died in 2018, so luckily, he'll never meet anyone again. Back in 2000 or 2001, I was driving myself from visiting my mom in Colorado back to Arizona. I was in a station wagon and had a desk my mom had given me that was my grandfather's. I've always been scared driving at night, thinking that there's someone in my back seat that's gonna get me. This might be because of too many scary movies, or because my mom's paranoia rubbed off on me. I was in the army and drove back and forth a lot to visit her. She would get mad at me for sleeping at rest stops or gas stations and would always tell me that someone was going to kidnap and murder me. But I just didn't want to be bothered with the hassle and expense of motels most of the time. I digress. So I'm driving an empty stretch of highway, late night, with no other cars around. This red truck comes up behind me, flashing his lights and honking his horn at me. I was thinking to myself that there was something wrong with my car, or maybe there's something wrong with the desk in the hatchback, because why else would he be so insistent on me pulling over? So I pull over. I was in my mid-20s and still a bit naive, and I get out of my car. As I'm getting out of my car, he's directly behind me, still flashing his lights and honking his horn. I got to the middle of the car. I had planned on going back there to see what could have been wrong with my car. When it hit me, why is he still honking at me when I'm out of my car? Then he gets out of his truck. That's when I knew something just wasn't right. I jumped back in my car and sped off. The next exit was 45 miles away or so. He followed me the entire time. I take the first exit and go into a crowded grocery store with a laundromat next to me. There's an ambulance parked at the laundromat with the lights flashing, and I was next to it. I figured that if there was an ambulance, then eventually a police officer would show up. The man stayed in his truck in the grocery store parking lot, watching me the entire time. I was terrified. I didn't want to get out of my car, and felt like an idiot if I would have to tell someone what happened. I waited about an hour, and he finally left. After he left, I waited a little longer before continuing my drive back to Arizona. I was so paranoid and watching out for any red trucks the entire time. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years, I'm watching Unsolved Mysteries or some similar type of crime show with my hubby at the time. He knew what happened as we were dating when it happened, and what story pops up? One about a man on that same exact stretch of highway with a red truck that used those exact tactics to get women to pull over, and he murdered them. I'm really glad that my gut told me something was wrong and to get back into my car and drive. So, a little background here. My father was in the Army for 21 years, retired and moved to a very small town in Central Florida. He got bored after a couple years, and even though he didn't need the money between his retirement and what my mom was making as a bookkeeper, tax prep, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and it being a small town, the owners wouldn't care if I came there and helped him out with stocking the coolers or even running the register, as long as I didn't sell beer or smokes. This took place in the late 80s and early 90s. The actual story I'm gonna tell took place in 1990, and I remember the date well because it was shortly after my birthday, and being 15 in Florida, I had just gotten my learner's permit. My dad would let me drive him to and from work, just to get some experience on the road, both at day and night. I was sitting at my usual spot at a table that was set up along the window, book in hand, feet propped up, and a Mountain Dew on the table along with some snacks. I would generally spend most of the evening that way, reading books, getting up to run the register, stock the cooler at different times. I remember glancing up because something caught my attention that was unusual, and I realized that it was a lady walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. The gas station was right on the I-75. This in itself was very strange because of where we were located. You didn't get many people walking, and definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured that she had broken down somewhere and was coming to use the phone to call a tow truck or something. I was completely wrong. She came into the store, looked around for a few minutes, and I remember just getting a real strange, creepy feeling about her. She walked up to the counter and started telling my dad a story about how she had gotten stranded and needed a ride to the next big town up north. Ocala was the town. This is important. My dad lets her know that he's working and there's no way that he can take her. She turns and looks at me, and while she is looking away from him, my dad catches my eye and subtly shakes his head no. I was confused for a second, but then she turned back to my dad and points at me, asking if I could take her. My dad responded back that I only had my learner's permit and wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere and then drive back. Normally I would have done it, even though it's illegal, because I've done it a few times before already. I didn't argue with my dad since it was completely out of character for him. He was normally chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason he was almost cruel and dismissive of her. Turns out he had a bad vibe about her from the minute he had seen her walking up the drive. Well, she cusses him out for a minute, and he basically tells her to get out of the store. She slammed the door open. I thought the glass was going to break from how hard she slammed it, and then she stalks out of the store and down the driveway. I kept an eye on her and continued to watch her as she made her way back to the interstate and then starts up the northbound on-ramp. Almost a year passes and I'm in my bedroom, less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad yelling from the living room, "Son, get your ass in here, look at this." I quickly run to the living room and see my dad pointing at the TV and look at the mugshot of a lady up on the screen, and immediately remember the lady who had been in the store. Turns out I almost gave a car ride to Aileen Wuornos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer and later put to death. Still have nightmares about what could have happened. This happened around a decade ago when I was a quintessential angsty, weird little teenager, quite moody and angry at the world. Ironically, I think that's what ultimately saved me, but the guilt doesn't leave me. I've never shared this with anyone before. My family had lived in one of the nicer neighborhoods in my city, and unfortunately muggers weren't uncommon, though to my knowledge at the time, none had resulted in anyone's death. I wasn't really following the neighborhood news, or any news really. I could tell that my mom was getting increasingly worried over the past few months, but I just didn't care enough to ask why. She kept reminding me to lock the doors, travel in groups, not to talk to strangers, yada yada yada. The same spiel most reasonable parents give to their kids, only I took insult at being lectured weekly about safety at 16. Our first fight about this happened when I was told I wasn't allowed to walk home from the train anymore. I was taking some extracurricular lessons at the center of the city and rode the train to the end of the line where we lived, which was in no way remote. Our apartment building was about a 10-minute walk from the station, and I had been doing that distance since I was little. I could literally do it with my eyes closed. I usually walked around with my headphones on and much beloved CD player in my bag, listening to something loud and grungy, feeling completely safe in my little bubble of melodious solitude. Lots of yelling and screaming, lots of, "You still treat me like a child. You don't trust me. You are suffocating me. You are taking away my freedom. You are the worst mother ever." Drama, you get the idea. Eventually, we came to a compromise. As long as it was still light out, I could walk home. Otherwise, I'd give her a call and she would pick me up. I was fine with that, for a time. On this particular night, however, I was really angry. Don't ask me about what. I honestly don't remember the reason. I just remember the wrath. I wanted to scream bloody murder, and the feeling got even more exasperated when I realized I had to call my mommy to come pick me up. Nope, no way, I wasn't doing that. Didn't matter that it was raining. I wasn't a baby or made of sugar. I got out of the train, ignored the heavy rain, and marched straight home. On the outside, I must have looked like a normal 16-year-old listening to some music while hurrying home. But on the inside, I was preparing to crush my enemies, seeing them kneeling before me and hear the lamentation of their women. The way from the station to my home is pretty well lit, except for one turn. Back then, there were unkempt hedges on both sides of the corner. One in the front of an abandoned lot, and no streetlights at all for about 100 feet. I approached the turn completely oblivious of my surroundings, internally planning my revenge against yet another unidentified foe, when someone jumped out beside me from the bushes, wielding a large kitchen knife. Most of what follows I remember in a blur. I don't remember what he looked like. It was dark and he was wearing a hood. I remember he smelled strongly of medicinal alcohol, but I honestly don't recall him saying anything. He probably didn't have enough time anyway, because when he jumped out of the shadows, I was startled and dropped my Discman, and that was it. I saw red. I completely lost it in the sky. All the frustrations poured out of me like a dam breaking, and I unleashed a torrent of swear words at him, most of them which I made up on the spot. I completely ignored the knife, shoved him backwards, kept screaming, "Are you fucking kidding me right now?" over and over, and bent down to pick up my shattered CD player. I don't know what he did, and to this day I don't know why he didn't attack me when I was crouched down, but when I gathered all the pieces and stood up, he was nowhere to be seen. Holding the pieces of my broken Discman and CD, I continued my march home, muttering a variation of, "Great, just great, that's just perfect. What else is gonna happen today to make this even shittier?" And on occasion turning around to yell, "Fuck you, man," at a general direction of the guy. When I got home, I got straight into a fight with my furious mother for not calling her, and made sure not to mention what happened out of fear that it would give credence to her side. The gravity of it all hit me in the shower after the adrenaline had subsided, and yet I think I still cried more for my broken Discman than realizing the danger I had put myself through and what I had just survived. It all came crashing down on me 2 days later when one of my neighbors was found stabbed in the lot behind the hedges where I was attacked. I didn't know her well. We went to Sunday school together, but my family and hers had been neighbors for years. I overheard my mom talking on the phone about the serial killer that was making his rounds around most of the affluent parts of the city, and how this was the latest in the series of muggings and stabbings in the area. I worked in a small memory care about 5 years ago, and there's only 2 of us on staff on the evening shifts. We had an agency CNA come into work with me, and it was our first time working together and meeting. The girl was young, 17 years old, and we began talking while we were working, and she told me she needed to go out to her car real quick. She goes and comes back and was telling me about her boyfriend. They were arguing over text. She told me that he was waiting in her car until she got out of work, which was an 8-hour shift. Alarms were going off, and I was thinking to myself how weird it was, and I was going to go outside and tell him to leave, but a small voice told me not to, and I listened. Our shift goes on and we are continuing to talk, and she tells me that her mom doesn't want her hanging out with him anymore due to the situation that happened. Backstory: they got into an argument in her basement, and he went upstairs and grabbed a knife. Her stepdad caught him and asked the boyfriend what he was going to do with the knife, and he said that he was going to hurt himself. She told me the story, and I had this pit in my stomach, and I looked at her and said, "He wasn't going to hurt himself, he was going to hurt you. You need to get away from him." At the very end of her shift, we had a long talk, and I told her that she was too young to be going through this, and there's a lot of other people out there. She doesn't need to be involved with someone like that. And I told her, "The next time I see you, I don't want to see you on the news dead." Before she left, she told me that her mom, who worked in the same agency, was coming in to work the night shift. The young girl went on her way, and her mom came in. I had to tell her mom that she was still hanging out with this guy. The mom forbid her from seeing him, and I could see why. As a mom myself, I would want to know if it was my daughter. The mom was really thankful and gave me a big hug, and I went on my way. Later, I started working at this agency myself and saw the young girl's stepsister, who also worked at the agency, at the facility I went to. I got really excited to see her and asked how the other girl was doing, since she referred me to this job. With a straight face, she told me that she was murdered by her boyfriend. He shot and killed her a few weeks after I had seen her at my job. I feel absolutely sick that happened to her. And the messed up part is, it was all over the news, and that was one of the last things I told her I didn't want to see. It's really messed me up to the point where I had to go to therapy afterwards. I'm glad I listened to my gut instinct, because he could have easily hurt me if I went outside and told him to leave when he was waiting in his car. After finding this subreddit today, and after having posted a very abbreviated version of the story a couple times in other threads, I asked my mom for a more detailed version of the story and thought I would share it. This happened circa 1971 or 1972, when my mother was about 14 or 15 years old. This incident occurred in a heavily wooded area near Montevallo, Alabama. My mother is the oldest of 5 children. She had 3 sisters and a brother, who is the baby of the family. One weekend, in the cooler months of the fall, my grandfather decided to take the whole family, my grandmother, my mother, all of my aunts, and my uncle, so 7 people total, into the woods for target practice with a rifle. My mother grew up quite poor, and they didn't always live in the best neighborhoods, so my grandfather wanted to teach the kids how to defend themselves with a rifle, if need be. Like I said, it was later in the fall, so the trees were bare and there were a lot of leaves on the ground. The wooded area was just off the dirt road, so this was a fairly rural area they were in. Since it was so far off the unbeaten path, my grandfather became startled when he heard the roar of a car engine so deep into the woods. My mom remembers the car being a blue Ford Galaxy. Despite the fact that my grandfather had a gun, he totally freaked out and told my grandma and the kids to hide under a pile of leaves in the woods. He hid with them. The man in the driver's seat got out, dragged a woman's body out of the car and just dumped it there in the woods and drove away. After my grandfather was sure that the man was gone, everyone came out of hiding and the woman sat up and stared them straight in the face. My grandfather asked the woman if she needed help. She said no, and that she would be fine. She didn't seem to be injured and obviously didn't want help. She hadn't put up a fight with a man when he was dragging her out of the car. My grandfather cut the shooting lesson short and decided to rush the kids home to safety. Well, on the trail back to the dirt road where my grandfather had parked the car, they passed a man in a blue Ford Galaxy driving out of the woods. My mom looked over and noticed that he had a huge machete laying across the front seat right beside him. My grandfather made sure that the man couldn't see that he was carrying a rifle, and everyone was careful not to give away what they had just seen. The man struck up small talk with my grandfather, asking him what they were doing in the woods. My grandfather explained that he had just taken the family out for some target practice with a rifle. The man told him to have a nice day and continue driving. The next day, my grandfather went back to the spot in the woods. There was not a body there. However, he did find the woman's wig, her purse, some Kleenex, and a pair of eyeglasses. He collected the items and took them home. According to my grandfather, that area of the woods was known as having shallow graves and being a dumping site for bodies. My mother became hysterical when he walked in the door carrying the stuff. She started screaming, "He killed that lady? He killed that lady?" My grandfather ended up taking the items to the police station, but my mom doesn't think anything ever came of it. She never heard anything else about it after that. Well, she did hear one thing about it. I guess early the next morning, my grandmother called my mom when she arrived at work just before the kids left for school. She told them not to take the bus that day, that she would come home and pick them up and drive them to school. When my mom asked why, my grandmother said, "Because that car is waiting for you at the bus stop." I used to work at a sex shop. I know how that sounds. And while yes, we sold porn and toys and whatnot, we primarily sold lingerie and the store was obviously geared towards women. It's important to note that at this particular location, only one person was working at any given time. As in, on a dead night, I was the only living soul in the building. I know now how stupid and dangerous it was to accept a job where there wasn't even a coworker, let alone a manager with you at all times, given that we were all young females and closed at midnight. Even though we weren't supposed to carry any type of weapons, I always had a pocket knife. Brilliant, right? I was too young to carry a gun, but there was a guy that worked next door that was super nice and always came to help me if I needed it. Customers getting rowdy, call him and boom, he'd come running. He lived about a block away from the store, so I always felt better about that. That being said, we did have our creepers that came in all the time. I kinda expected that when I got the job. However, no one really seemed dangerous, just people constantly asking me awkward questions. Again, I kind of expect that. However, about a month after I started working there, we started getting these weird phone calls every couple of weeks. A guy would call, say that he lost some sort of bet and had to do something humiliating. Sometimes he had to mow his lawn in a pink bikini with high heels. Sometimes he had to let his coworkers tie him up at his desk and leave him there, etc. We assumed that it was a prank caller and let it go. However, after a certain amount of times, we began to notice that the guy was calling on my shift, and if anyone else answered, he would say that he had got the wrong number and hang up. We knew it was him. He had a pretty distinct voice. His calls gradually became more and more frequent, and he would ask more and more unusual things. He would ask me to describe certain lingerie down to what kind of stitching it had and everything. I started getting frustrated, obviously, and would start snapping at him, telling him that this was the third time that he called this week, go somewhere else, whatever I felt like saying at the time. Where I worked, even if we know it's a prank call, we're supposed to try to be our wonderful, happy retail customer service providers that would make our bosses proud. So I would start off the calls trying to be helpful, knowing damn good and well where it would end up. Anyway, one night he asked me if I had a particular type of corset, which we did, and he said that he would be by that night to look at it. I got creeped out by this and asked the guy that worked next door to come in and sit with me until closing, which he did. When I brought this up to my manager, she brushed it off. I asked if I could start working with a coworker, but no, it wasn't in the budget. Moving on, the call stopped for about a week. He began calling again, saying that he was going to come by sometime that night, yada yada yada. I started brushing them off as more of his prank calls until one night. We were dead. I was in the store alone by myself, and a guy walked in and said he had a strange question. My heart sank as soon as I heard him start talking. I immediately sat down behind the counter and refused to stand up and come out on the floor. He said that he had lost a bet and that he had to parade around downstairs dressed as a woman. Do you sell fake breasts? I told him no. If it was closer to Halloween, he could go to a costume store and could likely find some foam breasts there, but the closest thing that we could suggest was a stuffed bra. Then he asked, as serious as can be, if he knew where I could buy some breast tissue. You know, like women lose to mastectomies. In my head I'm thinking, a fucking morgue? But told him that's more than I could help him with. He looked around the store for a minute and left. Once again, I called the guy from next door, and he came and sat with me. The next time I worked, I sat by the panic button anytime I wasn't helping a customer. Why I didn't walk out and say they didn't pay me enough for this, I'll never know. Sure enough, he came back in once I was by myself. I heard the front door open and he comes running to the counter, asking if we sold honeymoon kits. I pointed to the corner of the store where they would be at and sat right back down. He slowly circled the room, pretending to look at the merchandise. I was watching him on the security cameras and noticed every time that he would walk past one of our storage doors, he would lean in and listen. Holy shit, he was making sure I was really alone in there. When he got back around to the counter, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and pretended to start talking to someone, and ran back out the door. Now, he was close enough to the counter that I could hear everything. The phone number rang, and it didn't vibrate. Once I knew that he was out of the store, I went to the front window to try to get the license plate number, because now I know that this guy is whacked. He was already gone. It's hard to explain the layout of the store, but let's just say that for him to be gone by the time I got to the window, he had to have had his car running and waiting for him to come back out. However, I was able to see that it was a white SUV with round tail lights. That's it. Figuring this has gone beyond asking a friend for help, I called the local police department, who said that they would send an officer out to stay in the parking lot while I closed. As it turns out, the officer came out early to ask about the situation and that he would come back at midnight. Between the phone calls with the station and the time the officer came into the store, I noticed a white SUV crawl through the parking lot right against the building. The officer comes and goes, and by the time he came back that night, that same SUV went through the parking lot 4 more times. However, since I didn't see the guy's face for sure, I didn't call the police. At the time, I thought that was a huge no-no, making calls when you're not sure, although later they assured me given the situation, I should have called. Sounds stupid now. Anyway, after that night, I turned in my 2 weeks notice and got a job elsewhere. Everything was fine for several weeks, actually a few months, until one night I was in the car getting ready to go to dinner with my husband, when I get a phone call on my cell. I didn't recognize the number, but I had recently gotten a new phone. I wasn't sure if it was a deleted contact. I answered and sure enough, it was him. Side note, I'm a part of a website that offers spiritual counseling and whatnot. Don't ask, just go with it. He said he got my number from the website and wanted to know if I gave gender role counseling. I said that I hadn't before, but I'd give it a try and gave him my work email associated with the site, hoping that he would email me and I'd have more evidence to turn into the police. First of all, the site never had my phone number. Second of all, since I don't know where he got my number, I don't know if he knew my address, where I went to school, etc. Third of all, I'm now convinced that this guy wanted to go all Buffalo Bill and wear my damn skin. So finally, I go to the police department, file a report, and give them my number. No clue what they did with it, but the call stopped and I never saw the guy again. It's been a little over a year now and I don't live in the same state anymore, thankfully.